see, but I'm grateful to be able to present this to you, and thank you so much for inviting me, welcoming me to do this, to answer the question, but how can we demonstrate that Peter is the rock in Matthew 16:18? Well, first I want to look at Mark chapter 3, verses 16 through 19, which also summarizes Jesus giving this name to Simon. Jesus appointed 12 in that passage, just like the 12 patriarchs of old, the 12 tribes of Israel. He gives nicknames to the first 3 of these apostles. Simon, he calls Peter, and then he speaks of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, as the sons of thunder. And a lot of people had nicknames back then, and this was often because people had very common names, and it was easy to mix them up with other people. So you've got 2 disciples named Simon, you've got a couple disciples named Judas, and so on. So you need to be able to differentiate them. So the nicknames were important. But nicknames normally had meanings. People didn't just get a nickname for nothing. Like perhaps with me, they'd call me Baldhead. But in any case, nicknames normally had meanings. So Peter is called Rock, Petros, for a reason. Mark chapter 8, verses 27 to 33, we find a passage that's related to the one that we have in Matthew. This one, Peter recognizes that Jesus is the Christ, and that's good. But Mark leaves out the commendation. Why is that? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But he recognizes that Jesus is the Christ. He's the one who speaks for all the apostles at that point. And then Jesus goes on to speak of his sufferings. Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. Jesus turns and rebukes Peter in front of all the other disciples. It's helpful to keep in mind that the disciples were young, probably most of them, given the average age of disciples back then, most of them were probably teenagers. Peter may have been a bit older since he was married. Mark chapter 1, he had a mother-in-law. But, maybe he's in his early 20s, we don't know. But the way they act makes a bit more sense when we understand what age they were, and Jesus is older than they are, and he's teaching them, he's mentoring them. But Jesus rebukes him because Peter doesn't understand yet at this point what it means for Jesus to be the Christ. That is, Jesus is going to suffer. That's part of his mission. And so Peter, Petros, here acts a bit more like the Petrodes, the rocky soil, in chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, receiving the word with great joy. But when persecution comes, and you see this in chapters 14, in chapter 14, you see Peter falling away temporarily. Jesus rehabilitates him, and you can see that in the special message to Peter in chapter 16 and verse 7 of Mark. But the reason for Peter's nickname is not because he's like rocky soil at this point. The reason for Peter's nickname is because Jesus knows what he's going to make of Peter. So Jesus makes Peter into a foundation, into a rock. Now, Mark lacks the commendation that we have in Matthew, and I think, personally, the reason for that is what we also find in the church fathers. I mean, as early as Papias, writing in the early 2nd century, about something that he learned from people in the 1st century. So within living memory of the time that Mark and Matthew were written. And that is that he recognizes that Mark got the stories from Peter. Peter's a humble person. Peter's looking back on, wow, this Jesus I was with, he's so wonderful. And man, I stuck my foot in my mouth sometimes. I said the wrong things sometimes, but Jesus is so perfect. He wants to honor Jesus. So he's not going to honor himself in this gospel that gives his story. You know, he's talking about his frailties. But Matthew Matthew can talk about Peter's commendation. And so Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18, and I tell you, you are Peter, you are Petros, and on this rock, on this Petra, I will build my church. Now, there have been two objections to citing this. One objection comes from traditional Protestants who said, no, the rock can't be Peter, it's got to be Christ. And the other objection comes from more liberal Protestants who say, Jesus actually didn't say this. So let me deal with the second one first, the idea that Jesus didn't say this. There are a lot of Semitic expressions in this passage. Davies and Allison and other scholars, I think, have made a pretty strong case, and I believe the case is pretty strong, that this actually goes back to Jesus. And that, you may understand why some people didn't want it to go back to Jesus, but expressions like binding and loosing are traditional Semitic expressions. They're not something that would have been made up by later Christians. And also the language of building the church. Well, God often spoke in the Old Testament about building his people. And the church, Greek word ekklesia, goes back to the same Hebrew term in the Old Testament to which synagogue, Greek term, also goes back. The Hebrew term kahal, that is the assembly, the congregation of God, often used for the congregation of God in the wilderness. So God's people, building up God's people. Well, God's people will be built on this foundation that is mentioned here, on this rock. Petra and Petros, some have argued, no, they're not the same word. In classical Greek, they may have had somewhat different meanings. But by this period, the Koine period, in Greek, Petros and Petra were usually used pretty interchangeably. Moreover, Jesus speaking to Peter, he wouldn't need to be speaking in Greek. He could be speaking in their mother tongue in Galilee, which would be Aramaic. And in Aramaic, his name would be Kepha, or Kephas. It comes over into the New Testament Greek, which is what Paul usually calls Peter. He usually calls him by his Aramaic name, Kepha. And Kepha, Kepha is just rock. It doesn't distinguish between a little rock and a big rock. So if he's speaking in Aramaic, he's speaking of one rock. You are Petros, you are Kepha, and on this Petra, on this Kepha, I will build my church. Plays on words were common for making arguments and making points back then, and it's surely more than coincidence that he speaks in both cases of rock. Moreover, we can see how this was understood elsewhere in early Christianity. So, for instance, in Galatians 2:9, we have the three pillars in the Jerusalem church. James, really that's Jacob in Greek, in English, Jacob, but it goes back to Jacobos or Yaakov in Hebrew. James, Cephas, and John. These were the pillars of the Jerusalem church. Well, what are pillars for? Pillars are for supporting a building. There's a sense in which we all, Revelation 3:12, it makes us all in pillars in the house of God. But there's more. He speaks of a temple built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20. So continuing this image of foundation, the stone. And then Revelation chapter 21, verses 12 through 14. You have 12 gates representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And the foundations of the New Jerusalem, of the eschatological people of God, are the 12 apostles. So again, their foundational role, very similar to what you have mentioned in Isaiah chapter 51, verses 1 and 2. Look to the rock from which you were dug, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah who bore you. So it makes good sense that Peter functions here as a foundational rock, kind of like Abraham did for the 12 tribes in the Old Testament. Well, now in what sense does he function as the rock? Does he function as a rock in the same sense as in Deuteronomy 32, where God is the rock of his people? Nobody says that Peter is God. So in what sense does he mean that Peter is the rock? Well, in chapter 16 and verse 23 of Matthew, going back to where we start, almost where we started talking about Peter as the rock, Matthew 16:18. When Peter says, okay, you're the Messiah, he gets that right, but then he says, basically, you're not going to suffer if you're the Messiah. And that's when Jesus says, okay, Peter, you said I'm the Christ. I say you're Peter. You say I'm not going to suffer. I say you're Satan. Get behind me. And there in chapter 16 and verse 23, as John Meyer has pointed out, Jesus calls him a stumbling block. You're a stumbling block to me. So Peter goes from being a good rock when he confesses Jesus as the Messiah to being a bad rock when he denies the cross. Because the kind of rock that Peter is depends on his confession of who Jesus is and Jesus' mission. That is the gospel, the good news that's proclaimed. So in 16:16, you're the Messiah, and Peter responds, you're the rock on which I'm going to build my church. But back in chapter 7, verses 24 through 27, the foundation on which a person is to build so that they won't be swept away, the foundation, the rock, is Jesus' words. Well, what do these things have to do with each other? Well, again, the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets because they bring us Jesus' words. We are built on the foundation of the apostolic message, the Petrine message of who Jesus really is. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 and 16 says the foundation of the new temple is Christ. Well, how can the foundation be Christ and the foundation be the apostles and prophets? Well, the apostles and prophets laid the foundation by giving us the message of Christ. So he's the chief cornerstone. But we still have to build on them. We can't lay a new foundation, make up our own doctrine. No, it has to come from the apostolic message. When it says the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, Matthew 16:18. Well, again, Peter died, but Peter's message is eternal. And the gates of Hades, again, Semitic expression, Old Testament expression, the gates of death, that will not prevail against the church. Martyrdom will not silence us. Martyrdom could not silence Peter's message. The church continues to grow despite centuries of oppression and repression to keep us down. So the apostolic, the Petrine message, is the message of Christ for eternal life. And in that sense, Christ is the foundation for Christ is the foundation, and Peter is the foundation also, because it's through Peter, it's through the apostles that we have this message of Christ. It goes back to the first witnesses of Jesus, our Lord.